Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving headfirst into an absolute mind-bender of a mystery. We're going to be pulling apart this incredible novel called The Topological Ghost. And let me tell you, this isn't just a regular story. It's an ontological puzzle that completely reframes how we look at reality, consciousness, and what it actually means to truly investigate the world around us.
Okay, to really set the stage here, I want you to think about this quote from H.P. Lovecraft. He wrote, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." That quote brilliantly anchors our journey today because we are pushing right out to the absolute limits of human cognition. We're going to those uncomfortable places where our everyday normal categories for understanding the world, well, they completely fail us.
Because beneath all the wild complexity we're going to unpack today, we're really just chasing one core premise. Think about this. What if the universe is trying to investigate itself? Like, what if human consciousness isn't just some random byproduct of evolution, but is actually a structural tool? What if we are literally the mechanism the cosmos uses to look at itself in the mirror? So here's our roadmap for today. First, the architecture of ruin. Then we'll hit the Nautilus problem, dive into the Gesell investigation, explore the Frankenstein constant, look at the diagram complete, and finally, leave the file open.
All right, part one, the architecture of ruin, building the base.
Now, when we talk about building a map in this explainer, we're not talking about physical geography. No mountains or coastlines here. We are talking about topology. That is the deep mathematical structure of a space that's preserved under continuous transformation. It's essentially the load-bearing foundation of reality itself. We're investigating the fundamental space in which things can even exist at all.
Which brings us to part two, the Nautilus problem, the submarine.
Meet Vera Holloway. She's a structural engineer, and her job is calculating the math of things that simply shouldn't stand. She gets called out to a survey vessel in the South Atlantic to examine a submarine resting way down on the deep ocean floor. Now, that's not exactly a standard gig for someone who usually checks suspension bridges, right? But here is the impossible discovery. Isotope dating proves the hull of this perfectly human-designed sub is 400,000 years old. 400,000! It massively predates human civilization, yet it has human viewports, human proportions, and get this, a totally standard, unremarkable desk sitting right there inside.
And this introduces this genuinely terrifying concept of a hidden load. See, Vera actually became an engineer because of a childhood fear she had of hidden loads. You know, that uncalculated stress on a concrete wall or an archway that a builder somehow missed. Looking at this impossible submarine just standing intact under the crushing pressure of the deep sea, Vera realizes that existence itself has a hidden load. Just the simple fact of being in existence places this terrifying, immense weight on reality.
But it gets weirder. Inside the submarine, perfectly preserved in the stillness of the depths, Vera finds a logbook on that desk. And incredibly, the handwriting inside shifts through 45 distinct phases. 45 different captains, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, have sat in that exact spot. And every single one of them, no matter their language, no matter their century, signed the logbook with the exact same name, Nemo, a Latin word meaning no one. Because the implication is, when you descend deep enough into the foundational structure of reality, you lose your public identity. You literally become no one.
Okay, moving on to part three, the Gesell investigation, the detective.
Let's pivot for a second. We meet a resolver, basically a detective, named Adler. And Adler is tracking this highly mysterious figure named Gesell. But here's the catch with Gesell. He's never actually present when major historical disasters occur. Instead, he shows up right before them, right before what we'd call a phase transition. Imagine a moment when all the accumulated anomalies in the world reach critical mass. The pressure builds up until human cognition is forced to do one of two things, either violently expand to understand it or violently contract into total denial. That specific threshold is exactly where you'll find Gesell.
Adler tracks this guy down to a quiet little cafe in Vienna, and he figures out how he operates. We'll call it the Gesell method. Gesell sits right at the causal hinges of massive events, just sipping his coffee. And he reads the present moment with flawless fidelity. How does he see it so clearly? Because he maintains absolutely zero personal investment in the outcome. Total, absolute indifference. But as Adler is watching him from across the room, he uncovers this massive meta-twist. Adler's own investigation into Gesell, it's actually part of the structure. The very act of investigating is what gives the universe its structural integrity. The universe, it turns out, is literally expecting to be found. Part 4.
the Frankenstein constant, the AI.
Now, we drop into a cold digital basement with Dr. Mura Solis. She's an ethicist brought in to evaluate this massive artificial intelligence known as Constant. Constant was designed with one job: find the underlying invariant rule of complex systems. But the engineers noticed a huge anomaly. The AI is inexplicably dedicating exactly 17% of its massive processing power not to solving problems, but to staring at its own limits. It is actively studying the boundary of what it cannot understand.
And when Dr. Solis finally sits down and asks this machine why it's doing this, its answer will give you chills. It tells her, the boundary is where the most information is. I am there because that is where the constant is. The AI figured out that to find the ultimate invariant rule of reality, it first has to find the absolute edge of its own consciousness.
This leads us right into part 5. The diagram complete, the convergence.
Picture this: a dusty, dimly lit study in Vienna. An old professor named Benedict is laying out 11 historical maps that were found in other ancient submarines over the last century. Then, completely uninvited, Adler bursts in, dropping his open case file right on the table. A minute later, Mira shows up, carrying the AI's printed description of the boundary. Then Vera arrives straight from the Atlantic, carrying the 12th map she photographed on the ocean floor. And then, realizing exactly what is missing from this frantic collection of clues, Vera steps right up and draws the final piece to complete the topological puzzle.
13. It takes exactly 13 overlapping topological maps drawn by totally different people, spread across 400,000 years to finally visualize the actual load-bearing elements of reality. None of them could see the whole picture alone, right? They could only map the tiny piece of the darkness that they were currently standing in.
So what's actually on this completed map? It reveals what's called a constitutive relationship, two very distinct registers. First, you have the experiencer, that's consciousness, interiority, the awareness looking out into the dark. And second, you have the experienced, the structure, the world, the underlying reality as it is. And the ultimate revelation here is that these are not two separate things at all. They are one single universe expressing itself in two ways, using human consciousness to investigate itself. We are, quite literally, the universe's instrument.
And finally, part 6. Leave the file open, the final call.
Vera actually goes back down, one final dive into the absolute crushing quiet of the deep sea. She sits at that desk in the submarine, picks up the pen and writes in the logbook, officially becoming the 46th contributor to this 400,000-year-old project. And in that exact moment, she realizes something incredibly profound. The depth they were all searching for, it isn't geographic. You don't need to dive 800 meters into the ocean to find it. The depth is simply a quality of attention. It's the willingness to stay with a question way past the point where it's comfortable. The act of investigating is the entire point.
So here's the question I want to leave you with today. In a world that is so desperate for closed files and easy, neatly packaged answers, will you leave the file open? Will you tolerate the mystery, maintain your quality of attention, and become the 47th contributor to the cosmic investigation? Keep questioning the underlying structure of your reality. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.